Hunger and darkness. The winter of 1348 descended upon Yorkshire like a curse, wrapping itself around the remote stone walls of Okehaven Castle with merciless, suffocating force. Snow piled higher than a man's shoulder, and the wind that swept across the moorlands carried with it the sharp, penetrating bite of starvation. The castle stores dwindled with each passing week, and the faces of its inhabitants grew increasingly gaunt and desperate. The surrounding forest, known throughout the region as the Whispering Peaks, had earned its ominous name through centuries of dark rumors and disappearances. Its ancient trees twisted together so thickly that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting the woodland floor in perpetual twilight. The castle's steward had issued strict prohibition against venturing beyond the tree line. Those foolish or hungry enough to ignore this warning and seek firewood or game rarely returned to tell their tales. Among those who did survive their ventures into that cursed wilderness, the accounts were always the same: towering shadows that moved with impossible grace, and eyes that burned with an amber fire in the darkness, eyes that seemed almost intelligent, almost aware. Clary Hensley, the lowest-ranking scullery maid in all of Okehaven, did not have the luxury of surrendering to fear. Her life before the castle had been spent in the blood-soaked markets of York, where her father had worked as a butcher. She had learned the weight of a bone saw in her hands, the particular stench of offal and raw flesh, and perhaps most importantly, the gnawing, constant ache of an empty belly. These lessons had hardened her against the softer emotions that plagued others. Now, years after her father's death had forced her into indentured servitude to repay his mounting debts, she existed in the shadowy kitchens of the castle, scrubbing endless stone flagstones until her fingers bled, enduring the cruel strikes of Mrs. Higgins' cane across her shoulders for the slightest infractions. The head cook was a woman as cold and bitter as the winter that gripped their fortress, and she wielded her authority over the lower servants with the ferocity of a tyrant. The master of the castle, Lord Alistair Croft, had been absent for nearly 8 months. Word came sporadically that he was fighting in the king's wars across distant waters, though many whispered that he had been slain in battle, and the reports were merely being delayed. Without his presence, without even the distant authority his name commanded, the castle seemed to be slowly surrendering to the creeping paralysis of starvation. The first gift. The strange sequence of events began on a bitterly cold Tuesday morning in the middle of November, when the frost lay so thick upon the ground that each footstep cracked like breaking ice beneath one's weight. Clary had risen before dawn, as was her duty, to make the journey to the well that stood near the boundary between the cultivated castle grounds and the wild forest beyond. As she rounded the corner of the kitchen annex, her breath crystallizing in the frigid air, she found herself drawing to an abrupt halt. There, sprawled across the cobblestones, as though deliberately placed, lay a magnificent red stag. The animal's throat had been savagely torn open, the wound far too large and jagged to have been made by any ordinary hunter's arrow. The hindquarters bore a series of deep puncture wounds, the distinctive marks of something with teeth far larger than any wolf or hunting dog that roamed these lands. Blood pooled around the carcass in a brilliant scarlet halo, still steaming faintly in the Arctic air. Even more disturbing were the tracks pressed into the frozen mud surrounding the kill. Paw prints, enormous beyond any natural measure, each one the size of a dinner plate, led away from the body and into the darkness of the forest beyond, where any sensible servant would have screamed, fainted, or run directly to alert the guards. Clary did something entirely unexpected. She stood perfectly still, her mind working through the practical implications of what lay before her. What she saw was not a sign of demonic intervention, but rather the most precious resource their starving castle desperately needed. She saw meat. Without allowing herself a moment to reconsider, Clary seized the heavy stag by its hind legs and began dragging it toward the kitchen entrance. The trail of blood marking her path was long and unmistakable. Mrs. Higgins's shriek when she discovered the blood pooling across her pristine kitchen floor could have woken the dead. The old cook flew into a frenzy of rage and terror, striking Clary repeatedly with a wooden spoon and ranting about devils and demonic intervention. "You foolish, wicked girl," she howled. "That corpse is cursed. The beasts of the wood are tormenting us. testing us. You must throw it back over the castle walls immediately before they come for all of us." But Clary remained unmoved by the older woman's hysteria. She met Mrs. Higgins' gaze with the calm pragmatism of someone who had seen far worse than an old cook's fury. "This is a fresh kill, prepared by whatever hunts in that forest," Clary said, her voice steady and sure. "Our people are consuming boiled leather and vegetables that have rotted to mush. The guards no longer have the strength to properly wield their weapons. We will cook this meat, and we will eat it, and we will live a little longer because of it." Driven by pure survival instinct and an iron will, Clary seized her collection of rusted cleavers and began the work she knew best. She approached the stag with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned butcher, separating the ruined meat from the prime cuts with methodical precision. She removed every usable portion, wasted nothing that could sustain life. By the time night had fallen over the castle, the great hall and kitchen corridors were filled with the most intoxicating aroma, that of roasted venison, delicately seasoned with precious rosemary and salt from the castle's dwindling stores. For the first time in months, the servants of Okehaven ate until they felt satisfied. Their ribs were no longer visible beneath their worn clothing. The whispers that rippled through the servants' quarters spoke of Clary's courage and quick thinking, though Clary herself felt no sense of bravery. Instead, she felt only the primal, ancient satisfaction of having assured survival for another day. She believed this was a singular occurrence, a bizarre stroke of fortunate chance. She was profoundly mistaken, the pattern. 3 days passed in relative normalcy. The castle stores remained slightly fuller, the servants slightly less gaunt. But on the fourth dawn, when Clary went to collect water from the well, she discovered another gift waiting. This time a wild boar lay sprawled across the same stones where the stag had rested. Its neck was broken with clinical precision, an unusual kill method for any predator, suggesting an intelligence in understanding of anatomy that seemed impossible. Again, the massive paw prints surrounded the carcass, leading back into the dark forest. Without hesitation, Clary butchered the creature and prepared it for the castle's consumption. She rendered portions of the meat into a rich, warming stew and cured the belly meat in salt for preservation. The castle ate better that night than it had in months. The pattern continued with inexorable regularity. A half-dozen pheasants appeared next, arranged in a deliberate line, each one killed with a precise bite to the throat, the rest of the carcass left untouched. Then came a massive brown bear, easily weighing 600 pounds or more, its enormous body dragged to the kitchen doors as though in mockery of the castle's weakness. The appearance of the bear sent genuine terror rippling through the fortress. When Clary examined the circumstances of the kill more carefully, she noticed that the snow surrounding the carcass had been torn and trampled in a way that suggested an immense struggle. Tufts of coarse, midnight black fur, quite different from that of the brown bear, were snagged on the brambles and branches nearby. The castle staff descended into panic. The guards began to refuse their patrols of the rear walls after nightfall. Theories proliferated through the servants' quarters. Some argued that the demonic beasts of the Whispering Peaks were deliberately fattening the inhabitants of Okehaven before they struck in force. Others claimed the kitchen door had become an altar, marked by some supernatural entity for sacrifice. Only Clary remained unshaken by these dark interpretations. While others huddled in corners and prayed, she carefully maintained and sharpened her collection of butchering knives, her movements methodical and unafraid. Yet Clary was far from blind or oblivious to the reality of her situation. She understood, with a certainty she could not quite articulate, that she was being watched. Often, when she ventured to the forest edge during the twilight hours to deposit the inedible scraps and bones into the woods, she felt the weight of an intense, focused attention pressing against her consciousness. The sensation was not one of hunger or predatory malice, but rather something more complex and deliberate. "You cook the meat," Alistair stated, stepping closer to her until only a few feet separated them. "I did, my lord," Clary confirmed, her voice remaining steady despite the wild acceleration of her heartbeat. "Your people were starving. The meat was fresh and clean. It would have been a grievous sin against God to allow it to rot and spoil." Alistair leaned in until his face was mere inches from hers. For a moment, Clary genuinely expected violence. A blow, or perhaps in order to have her hang for the transgression of touching game, meant for the Lord's exclusive use. Instead, his amber eyes dilated until they seemed to consume most of the visible white of his eye. He drew a slow, deliberate breath through his nose, inhaling deeply, drawing in her scent, the blood, the rosemary and salt, the smoke of the kitchen hearth, something uniquely and essentially her. "You do not fear the beasts that leave these gifts at your doorstep?" he asked softly, his voice dropping an entire octave lower than before. "I am far more afraid of starvation than I am of any animal, my lord," Clary replied with perfect honesty. "A dead creature is merely meat. Whatever brings me these offerings has not yet attempted to make me its prey." A complex emotion flickered across Alistair's features, something ancient and barely contained, before he seemed to gather himself and master whatever impulse had threatened to escape him. A muscle twitched briefly in his jaw. "See that you prepare a plate of the freshest cuts," he commanded abruptly, stepping back from her with sudden distance. "Leave it at the edge of the woods tonight, by the old standing stones. Do this and do not question my orders." With that, he turned sharply on his heel and strode from the kitchen, leaving behind only stunned silence. Part 5. The Revelation. That midnight, the storm that had ushered Alistair's return had broken apart, clearing the skies and allowing the light of an enormous full moon to bathe the castle grounds in ethereal silver illumination. Clary, wrapped in her warmest wool shawl and carrying a heavy iron platter laden with the most pristine venison steaks she could prepare, made her way through the deep snow toward the forest's edge. Her mind churned with confusion and half-formed questions. Why would the lord of the castle issue such an order? Why would he command her to feed the very creatures that had terrorized his lands and his people? What possible rational explanation could account for such a bizarre directive? She reached the ancient standing stones that marked the traditional boundary between castle grounds and forest wilderness. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the trees, and frost crackled with each gust. Clary placed the heavy iron platter down upon a flat rock, securing it against the wind. She had intended to immediately turn and retrace her steps back to the safety of the castle walls and the kitchens she knew. But something held her in place, some indefinable force that rooted her to the spot, preventing her from moving. A low, resonant vibration echoed through the darkness, not a sound precisely, but rather something felt through the ground and bones themselves. The massive black wolf emerged from the shadows of the pines, moving with that same terrible grace she remembered. It was even larger than she had recalled from her previous encounter, muscles flowing beneath its thick coat like living iron. It padded silently forward, coming to a stop mere inches from the platter of meat. But rather than immediately consuming the food, it regarded only Clary, its amber eyes catching the moonlight and burning with an intelligence that was far too human, far too aware. Then something unexpected occurred. The great black wolf limped. It shifted its weight, favoring its front left leg, holding it slightly off the ground as it moved. Clary's breath caught in her throat. She remembered with perfect clarity the slight limp that Lord Alistair Croft had displayed when he dismounted his horse in the courtyard mere hours before. "Lord Alistair," Clary whispered, the words escaping her lips before conscious thought could stop them. The wolf froze, absolute and complete. A suffocating silence fell over the snow-covered clearing, the wind seeming to hold its breath along with every living thing that witnessed this moment. Then horror unlike anything Clary had ever witnessed began to unfold. A sickening chorus of bone-cracking and tearing flesh filled the midnight air. Clary gasped and stumbled backward, but she forced her eyes to remain open, despite every instinct screaming at her to look away. The massive beast convulsed and contorted, its form elongating and transforming. Fur receded into pale human skin. Powerful, unnatural muscles shifted and reorganized themselves into human proportions. Bone restructured itself with wet, horrible snapping sounds. Within mere seconds, a man knelt in the snow before her, breathing heavily, entirely naked, his body steaming in the frigid air. Alistair slowly rose to his feet, the moonlight illuminating the fresh, jagged scar across his shoulder, the source of the limp she had observed. He looked at Clary, his amber eyes glowing in the darkness, and seemed to be bracing himself for the reaction he fully expected. The screams, the terror, the desperate flight into the darkness. But Clary, the butcher's daughter who had spent her entire life observing the truths hidden within flesh and bone, simply stared at him. Her gaze moved from his scarred human form to the plate of meat and back again, calculating, considering. "You are a dreadful hunter, my lord," she finally spoke, her voice trembling only slightly. "You destroyed the most valuable cut of the stag by tearing its throat apart. A skilled hunter uses precision." Alistair's response was a sound that was half laugh, half growl, something between human amusement and bestial emotion. He stepped toward her, entirely unashamed of his nakedness, closing the distance until the heat radiating from his transformed body warmed her frozen cheeks. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face with surprising tenderness. "My pack has been starving," Alistair murmured, his voice thick with raw vulnerability. "For centuries, the beasts that inhabit this forest have been hunted, cursed, forced to hide our true nature away from the eyes of men. But then a human girl discovers our kills and does not run. She does not scream in terror. She feeds us. She ensures the survival of both my people within the castle walls and my brothers and sisters who roam the forest beyond as we are meant to be." He leaned closer, resting his forehead lightly against hers. "I did not drop the prey at your feet because I wished to fatten you up, Clary, like livestock being fattened for slaughter. There is an ancient law among wolves, a tradition older than human kingdoms. We only bring the best of our kills to one singular person." Clary looked up into his glowing amber eyes, the question hanging unspoken in the air between them. "To their mate," Alistair whispered, the word carrying the weight of centuries of meaning. Clary's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the immensity and terrifying implications of those words. Before she could form a coherent response, a sharp snap of a branch shattered the moment like glass. Alistair spun with violent speed, throwing his arm protectively across Clary's chest. Stepping out from behind one of the standing stones came not a wolf, but a man clad in heavy chain mail, a loaded crossbow with a silver-tipped bolt held steady in his hands, the weapon aimed directly at Alistair's exposed heart. Sir Reginald Barrow, Lord Croft's most trusted knight and second in command, emerged fully into the moonlight. "I always suspected the rumors were true," Reginald said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You cursed abomination, and to think that all along you would be brought to your ruin by nothing more than a filthy scullery maid." He sneered, his finger trembling slightly as it positioned itself over the trigger mechanism. "The Bishop of York has been offering a fortune for pelts of the devil's spawn, and King Edward himself has promised me the deed to Okehaven Castle if I purge these lands of this demonic blight." Part 6. Blood and Transformation. Alistair did not flinch, though his bare skin was exposed to both the freezing wind and the deadly aim of his treacherous knight. Instead, he stepped slightly to his side, deliberately positioning his massive frame between Reginald and Clary. "You have always been a coward, Reginald," Alistair growled, his voice distorting, dropping into a guttural timbre that vibrated through the night air and resonated in the bones of those who heard it. "You could not best me in the training yard when we were mere youths, and you certainly cannot best me now, unarmed though I currently stand." "I don't need a sword when I have blessed silver," Reginald spat in response. He pulled the trigger. The mechanical snap of the crossbow echoed like thunder in the midnight air. Alistair roared, a sound that began as a human shout but ended in a deafening, monstrous snarl as he lunged forward with supernatural speed. The silver-tipped bolt caught him in the chest, burying itself deep beneath his collarbone. The impact threw Alistair backward into the snow. Where the poisoned metal made contact with his flesh, it burned and hissed, as though the silver itself was alive and hungry, consuming the tissue it touched. Reginald laughed, a cold, triumphant sound that suggested he believed the battle already won. His hands moved to his belt to crank the crossbow mechanism and load a second bolt, his movements confident and practiced. "Now for the mongrel maid," he said. "Can't have any witnesses to this." Clary watched helplessly as blood pooled around the man who had brought her salvation, as the faint the end.